Friends, a good day to you all. I am Zeid Hussein, the president of IPI, and I welcome you most warmly to this latest installment in our Global Leaders series, featuring an interview with the President of the UN General Assembly, His Excellency, Mr. Dennis Francis, on the occasion of the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. Mr. President, the warmest of welcomes to you. We are very honored to have you with us today. And with your permission, I would like to indulge in a brief introduction. Dennis Francis had a career spanning approximately 40 years in the diplomatic service of Trinidad and Tobago. For 18 of those years of unbroken service, he held the rank of ambassador until his compulsory retirement from career service in 2016. He holds the distinction of being his country's longest-serving ambassador. He's been a director of multilateral relations at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a senior advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs on all multilateral level measures or matters, including climate change and the negotiations on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. He is now serving as the 78th President of the General Assembly and is deeply committed, as we shall hear shortly, to the strengthening of multilateralism and diplomacy. The theme of his presidency is peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability, which he has described as his 4 watchwords, or the 4 supreme objectives set before the international community today. Mr. President, if we recreated the United Nations and the international system, how would you define the new principles needed for multilateralism to meet the realities of today?
The new principles would need to take account of the fact that the world has changed radically since 1945, when the architecture of the UN was established. We are actually in a period of transition at the moment. There are a number of new countries that did not exist in 1947 when the UN was established. Most developing countries, in fact, at that time, were colonial possessions. They did not have independence and therefore could not be members of the United Nations. But quite apart from that, the power relations in the world have shifted radically. And in that regard, we've moved and are moving away from what was largely a bipolar system dominated by the Western Alliance on one side and the Soviet bloc on the other side, to a system that is more multipolar, where you have China having risen, India, Brazil, South Africa, and countries that are exercising power, not just regionally, they're not just regional powers, they have global interests and are not timid to exercise those interests. So that's the first thing that would need to happen, because you have in the UN an archaic system in which membership of the Security Council, for example, there are no developing countries in holding the so-called P5 posts. That has been deemed, I think there's universal acceptance of the fact that that is unacceptable in the 21st century, needs to be addressed and redressed. That conversation is taking place. It's a conversation for the moment. It's not yet a formal negotiation. But the expectation is that when the dust settles, configuration of the Security Council would be quite different from what we have today. So that's the first thing. In addition to that, the General Assembly, which, as you know, comprises 193 member states, is organized along regional lines, regional representation. There are 5 groups, the largest of which, besides the regional group, the largest group of which is the developing countries group called the G77 and China. I believe it's 134 members of that group.
Yeah.
And that group defends and promotes the interests of the developing countries as a whole, particularly in matters of economic development, health, social and economic development issues. The GA finds itself currently in a somewhat unexpected position because of the fact that for a number of reasons, not the least of which is the importation of the existing geopolitical tensions in the system, the Security Council has been unable to effectively execute its mandate on peace and security. It has the dominant responsibility for peace and security in the system. But at the moment, they've been challenged to come to consensus on several issues. And so to a significant degree, the balance has shifted to the General Assembly to pick up the slack. There is provision in the rules of procedure for this. The Assembly, of course, may not exceed its authority. And so the General Assembly has now become, particularly in the last 2 years or so, the theater in which the wide cross-section of the members are able to have a say on matters of peace and security, where the General Assembly has a residual authority. Now, the only proviso is that we may not discuss a matter that is currently occupying the attention of the Security Council. But once that caveat is met, the General Assembly can deliberate on matters of peace and security, and we have. So that, for example, we've passed 2 resolutions on Gaza, both very strong, when the Security Council had not been able to pass any resolution on Gaza. In fact, there's a sense in which the General Assembly increased the pressure on the Security Council to get a resolution on Gaza because we had done it, and within maybe I think a month under the Chinese presidency, they did agree a resolution on Gaza. So we would, in the new configuration, the Security Council itself would change, and the General Assembly itself, having sort of been awakened to the need to pay enhanced attention to matters of peace and security, is likely to have also a stronger role in that configuration.
Yes, and you make such an important point here, because in the past there have been examples. One can think of the Korean War, the Suez Crisis in 1956, or even what happened in the subcontinent in 1970-71, times when the General Assembly stepped in. Are there specific examples that animate your thinking, which you draw upon for inspiration, past examples like those that make you think, yes, this is a lacuna that can well be filled with the right leadership supporting the membership in coming to positions? And if you could provide us with some examples that sort of have influenced your thinking.
For example, you have with respect to we have now the veto initiative, which is really an accountability and transparency mechanism. Now, the rules of procedure have permitted this, but it's something that had not been invoked really in the past. The advantage of the veto initiative, the intent, let's start with the intent. The intent really was sort of to discourage members of the Security Council from invoking the veto, because it was found that it seemed that there was excessive use of the veto in an almost arbitrary way, and not without regard and sensitivity to the gravity of the particular situation, particularly as it related to human rights and humanitarian issues, pain and suffering and that sort of thing. And so it was the intention that the veto initiative would cause members of the P5, the permanent five states, who have that privilege, who have that responsibility. I like to think of the veto as a responsibility more than a privilege, because the P5 is supposed to act on behalf of the General Assembly. And so it was a way of encouraging them to think once and twice and three times, to use the veto more sparingly and not use it as a tool in furtherance of what would be perhaps their national interests. The jury is still out to a significant degree on whether that has been successful. But what happens now is, once it is used, a process is triggered whereby they must come before the General Assembly and give account of their actions in using the veto. This, of course, opens the possibility for members of the General Assembly, all members, to take the floor and express their views. So there's a sense in which there's a broader discussion, and everyone, the entire world, gets a sense of what the view of the General Assembly is, and the distinction between the posture of the General Assembly and that of the Council. And to a significant degree, I think this has caused enhanced attention to be paid to the General Assembly by the general public, which is, of course, a good thing. Because in the past, as you know, most people, when the Security Council faltered or failed, would come to the conclusion, the UN they've disappointed us again. But now there is a clearer understanding that there are two distinct, though complementary, roles between the Security Council and the General Assembly. And we've invoked this procedure in respect of Gaza. In fact, we've invoked it. There's an example coming up very soon with regard to the resolution that was brought to the Security Council last week regarding the status of Palestine as a full member of the General Assembly of the UN. That issue will come before the General Assembly pretty soon for consideration. So there's been small, though important, improvements to the system. But that does not nullify the need for wider, more structural reform to the system, and in particular to the Council.
So could I take you just one step further, Mr. President, in the sense that, I mean, what you're saying is critical, of course, that the General Assembly is in a sense finding its space.
Yes.
20 years ago, I recall when often we were met, when I was a permanent representative, and we were met with a veto in the Security Council. We'd go to the General Assembly in a resumed session, extraordinary session, and we'd repeat the statements we made in the Security Council. In the past, what you saw happening is the General Assembly not just being a fora for the repetition of statements, but action, in the sense that the first peacekeeping operation with formed units, UNEF,
yes,
the emergency force, was created by the General Assembly and sort of managed by the General Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, from where you are now, that that's the trajectory that the General Assembly could well be on? That, as you said, it's a sort of a restatement of positions. It's making the permanent members explain how their veto is in the interests of the common good. Mm-hmm. And it opens up the space, as you're suggesting, for actions, not just a repetition of statements. Is that a correct appraisal of where your analysis is?
It is.
Yeah.
It is very much the case. I think the General Assembly itself, in the context of this situation, is quite determined to assert its own authority, to manage, in a sense, its own profile in the way it is perceived by third parties, and to be more perhaps rigorous in what it demands of the Security Council. It is not lost on the members of the Assembly that the Security Council acts on behalf of the Assembly. And therefore, it's appropriate that they must come and give an account to the Assembly. Even in the context of the reports, the annual reports that the Security Council sends to the Assembly, it had been the case that these matters were dealt with very routinely. That there's evidence that that has started to change. There's been discussions about the content of that report, that the content needs to be more substantive, and that when it isn't, that the General Assembly ought, in its own interest, to send the report back to the Council and say we need more details so that we are able to make a better analysis of the work of the Assembly. Yeah. And I think that is going to happen. So there is an awakening in the Assembly itself of its need to be more assertive and not allow its will to be overrun without questioning by the Security Council.
And I have to say, as someone who served in the Security Council 10 years ago, what I like about what it is that you're saying is that there was a sort of mechanical nature to the relationship that you now are saying is changing. That there is actually some thought going into it, and that the very powers as provided to the General Assembly by virtue of the Charter are being realized effectively.
Absolutely.
We
are in that phase.
That's terrific to hear. Mr. President, last week you hosted the first ever Sustainability Week at the UN headquarters here in New York, and recognizing we have passed the critical milestone of the midpoint in the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. What were the main outcomes of those events and discussions? And I wonder if you could share with our online audience.
Sure. Sustainability Week was our attempt, really, to shine a light on the fact that, on several things. First of all, the fact that urgent action is needed to return the SDGs to a track that would take us to the achievement of all 17 of the SDGs by 2030. As you know, only 15% of the SDGs are on track to be fulfilled by 2030. And so we thought that amalgamating these 5 mandated meetings into a single week would allow us to highlight the importance of sustainability in the global development sphere, and also help to, as the Secretary General likes to say, supercharge, incentivize governments, all the stakeholders, to supercharge progress towards the SDGs. So we started the week with an event on one of the core issues confronting the attainment of sustainable development, and that was on debt sustainability. It's very well known that many countries in the global south have a heavy overhang of debt. They're caught in a debt trap. The debt crisis is in fact a development crisis, because when countries are faced with the choice, it's almost Hobson's choice, of having to service their debt or invest in sustainable development, they realize really they have no choice. They have to pay the interest on the debt. The problem, however, is that once the interest is paid, they do not have resources left over to invest in education or in health. In fact, the statistic says that for very many countries, the expenditure on servicing the debt is larger than the expenditure on either education or health. And so what arose from this, member state after member state took the floor and described their own experiences. And clearly there's a pattern there that the system is not working for a large group of countries in the global south. And clearly it's not sustainable, because unless something is done to correct this imbalance in wealth between the North and the South, this imbalance in growth between North and South, what will have in fact happened is that you would have consigned millions of people in the global South to perennial poverty and misery. And of course, the SDGs, the central philosophy of the SDGs is to leave no one behind. So clearly, some sort of intervention is required at the systemic level to change the procedures by which the multilateral banks operate. That's the whole governance of these organizations needs to be rethought to make it easier for those countries in special situations, the small island developing states, the LDCs, the LLDCs, to be able to borrow from these institutions, but to do so on more affordable rates and with longer periods of amortization, and still be able to finance growth and investment in education and housing and health and those sorts of things. And so one of the goals that we have going forward is to engage the multilaterals to find a way to convince them that sustainable development will forever be doomed unless they can come along and adjust and amend their procedures so as to be in a better position to lift and support these countries in their development thrust. That is a key outcome of the week. We also discussed tourism, which is a huge industry globally, from 2 dimensions, from the point of view of sustainability, but also vulnerability, because after a major event, a major external shock, such as the pandemic, Many countries took a long time, and in fact, many still now have not fully recovered in terms of their the dynamism of their tourism sector. So that was an area of concern, organizing the industry in such a way that the recovery period is shorter and faster and more effective, but also sustainable tourism from the point of view of minimizing the carbon footprint of the industry on the planet. So it's a question of what materials are used in construction, the use of water. Tourism accounts for a substantial use of water. Using environmentally friendly technologies in the construction, things like solar panels, etc. But also sustainability from the point of view of the wages paid to people who work in the sector and who depend on the sector. 1 in every 10 people on the planet who work in the tourism industry. It's a huge figure.
Yes.
And therefore, this industry needs to be organized in a way to allow people to make a remunerative salary that is sustainable, but also to ensure that it minimizes the potential damage on the environment.
Yes.
Coral bleaching is an issue in many parts of the world, as you know.
That's right.
As is biodiversity loss. So it's a question of managing the resources that are available on the planet in a way that maximizes the value that we can extract from those resources without at the same time imperiling the resources for the long term.
That's right.
Yeah.
Could I, as a follow-up to your response, I would assume that the creditor countries listened very carefully to what was being said by those countries who labor under enormous debt burdens and have to make substantial payments in terms of interest.
Yes.
Did you sense that there is a change in tone, or change in tone could be possible? Clearly, in reaching out to the IFIs, that's the hope and the belief that, given the pressing nature of the sort of interconnected and transboundary pressures the world faces, that there's a greater sense of working together, not a retreat into sort of tribalism, if you will, that we saw with the pandemic, with the COVID pandemic treaty. I mean, did you sense that the creditor countries could be open to some of the suggestions that were being made by the countries of the so-called Global South?
If I'm to be guided by the rhetoric, I would say that I did detect that there is a possibility of a willingness to engage in those discussions. Of course, no commitments were given, but the tone was slightly different.
Yes.
And that gives me hope.
Good.
It's clear that they're paying attention. I've been on one of those missions a year ago in a different capacity to the multilaterals, and I came away at the time thinking, oh, this is just more of the same. But there is a difference, a very subtle difference in tone that I think if we can harness, we should be able to get some movement there.
So on this point of the anxieties being felt, I mean, clearly you've spelled out your own vision for leadership of the General Assembly, what the General Assembly can do, particularly because on the peace and security side, the Security Council seems stymied in getting its work done. What else can outside actors, many of those who may be watching us in this interview, what else can they do to assist those who understand fully how fundamental the multilateral system is, without which much of the world comes to a standstill? what can they do to help and encourage the UN, and how can they contribute to effective international cooperation? In other words, how can we the ecosystem around the UN, be of use to you?
Well, the UN was set up, again, 80 years ago. The context and the dynamics were quite different. And it was set up as what it exists today as, an intergovernmental organizations. But the world has changed. The problems have changed, both in complexity and nature. And so what we're confronting now are, perhaps 40, 50 years ago, the dominant concern related to questions of war and peace. And those are still central to the mission of the UN. But there are other issues that have come alive. We were talking earlier about the pandemic, for instance. There are problems, climate change, biodiversity loss, sea level rise. There's a problem with antibiotic resistance. I mean, we could go on and on. And so it's no longer practical, really, for the UN to work exclusively as an intergovernmental organization. We need the inputs of key stakeholders, people who work in areas or who are committed in certain ways to ensuring that the world achieves its best outcomes, to work with us, to contribute, to add their voice and to add value to the processes that shape these, how we tackle these issues. And so there is a growing awareness of the need for multi-stakeholder engagement in these processes, including by a wide cross-section of players, the private sector, civil society, academia, the philanthropic community, women, youth, disabled people, gender issues, indigenous peoples, because the whole thrust, as I said before, is to include everyone in, not to leave anyone behind. Governance in the contemporary era requires people to make in fact, there's a philosophy that things work best when people contribute to their own governance, because then they can take ownership of it. They feel a part of it. People like to be consulted. They want to be consulted because, in fact, they live in the zones. They have accumulated knowledge over the years, as have civil society organizations. So they know what works and what does not work. And I think the UN has awakened in recent years to that. Next month, in fact, in May, there is a civil society conference organized by the UN in Nairobi, in Africa, precisely to get the input of civil society into the Summit of the Future process. So we have made considerable improvements. Yet, I have to say that because our sort of articles of agreement, the Charter, is established as an intergovernmental organization, we are not yet in a position, without an amendment to the Charter, to facilitate direct participation in the negotiations by stakeholders. It does not in any way minimize the value of the contributions that they make. That is very well recognized throughout the United Nations. Yes.
No, that's an excellent response. And my final sort of observation and perhaps short question to you, it stems from my experience when I was UN High Commissioner for Human Rights,
Mm-hmm.
in realizing when looking at many countries through the prism of the SDGs, that it wasn't so much a case of people being left behind by changing technologies or by changing patterns of investment, and that the labor market has to reshape itself.
Yes.
In many countries, there is an almost forcible, deliberate, willful exclusion of certain categories of people.
Yes.
And so when we as the international actors point this out, then there's a populist reaction in the opposite direction saying, oh, now we see world government at play. Now you're coming to threaten us and enforce your will and your lockdowns and your decisions taken by, this sort of thing. So there is a counter-internationalist narrative that also exists. And in the era of social media, it sort of behooves us to work and counter that what we're working for is what you were saying. It's the most marginalized, the most left behind and disadvantaged, because if we help them, we ultimately help ourselves. And,
absolutely.
And that we don't have any hegemonic designs in any sense. And that message, I think, is resonating with your leadership and needs to resonate in the future.
One of the things that, of course, helps this process, number one, you have the existence of social media. You have considerable activism on social media.
Yeah.
And so these groups, they feel empowered in a modern age to make their views known on various issues that impact their daily lives.
Yeah.
So it's difficult, really. That pushback does exist to some degree, but it makes it very complicated for governments not to appreciate the value that these stakeholders bring. I think the line of defense, and I heard it as recently as this morning, is that it must be borne in mind that this is essentially a members-driven process. It's an intergovernmental process. There's no objection to filtering the contributions of stakeholders into the process. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it's my impression that that is fully appreciated by all of the member states.
Yeah.
It's a question of maintaining the integrity of the process as an intergovernmental one, so that those who do not represent sovereign states do not actually find themselves negotiating in the room, though their views can form part of the discussion, and inevitably will.
And here, I would only add a footnote in this, that, and many don't seem to understand it outside the UN, that the Secretariat is a principal organ of the organization. The Secretariat is on equal footing with the General Assembly and the Security Council. It has its own chapter devoted to itself. And the need for it is that when the membership itself is log-jammed, finds itself in a state of paralysis, and the independence of the Secretariat helps unlock some of the thinking that's required to make the transition forward. So at the times that we saw the greatest actions by the General Assembly in the past, it was a combination of leadership being exercised by the President of the General Assembly, a handful of ministers, a handful of ambassadors, and the Secretariat. And I think we're sort of in that space now, which is extremely interesting. And we wish you continued success, Mr. President. Thank you for taking part in this interview. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor having the President with us today. Thank you again for spending a few minutes.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.